Welcome to the Hunting Beast Podcast, your source for hunting tactics, news, and stories. And now your host, Mario Traficante.
The swamps, we have the farmland, and we can literally follow that pattern.
Nice. Alright, now we're starting to gain some momentum, getting through more of these. Next one. Alright, beds. Buck beds on hill country points. During my postseason scouting, I've noticed a trend of a half-circle trail from below the point wrapping around the outer edge of the point, ultimately connecting to the bed above on the tip of the point. Is this likely a morning J-hook, evening exit trail, or coincidental path of least resistance?
I would say it's one of the things he mentioned. If it's coming from below, I would assume that it's probably a J-hook. The trouble with J-hooks is they are much less locked in than a exit trail. So it could be an exit trail. But the fact that it's coming from below and circling in, and it's going to be on the wind, the side that it would be for that wind, I would say it's probably a J-hook. But I wouldn't rule out that it's an exit either. Here's what would rule it out. Okay, so you got that J-hook coming into the bed like this, and the wind's coming like this. Okay, and draw the J-hook once coming in there, like he's saying. Okay, so the
Probably be better if the wind was coming straight.
right.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so now whether or not, you can take the arrow off there too, because we don't know for sure, right?
Right.
So whether or not this is a deer coming in or going out is going to mean two things. If he's coming in, and that trail's that heavy, I can guarantee you there are heavy trails coming out of there for the evening. If the trail going in is that heavy, that you can see it that well.
Oh, and that speaks to the point that because they go in based on wind, it
Right.
means the wind is always blowing
Mhm.
across there like that, so he's using that over and over again.
So now if that trail is that heavy, and that's just an entrance trail, there is going to be heavier exit trails,
Right.
is my point.
Because he's using it all
So if
the
that's the
time.
heaviest trail, it's probably an exit trail.
Got it. Yeah, because wind is going to vary so much that there's no way he's going to take that same trail in over and over.
It's possible
and
there
over.
could be some obstacle that forces him to go in that way, or he can smell that way. It's
Right.
possible. But what I am saying is that if that is the case, the exit trails coming out of that bed are going to be even heavier.
Than that. Right, because
Yeah.
it's the matter of usage. Yeah.
I've seen it where you can see a J-hook trail going in. It ain't too often. Usually they're pretty light.
Yeah.
But when you do see it, the exit trails are heavier.
Yep, makes sense. Alright, here's a good one actually. Learning from previous hunts. When you go back to rescout an area you have already scouted or hunted in the past, what details are you searching for to combine with already gathered intel to make the picture more clear?
Okay, I want to make sure nothing changed. You know, I want to see that they're still using the routes I expect. And one thing I do want to do when I go back and look at something is I want to check out anything I saw. If I saw a buck do something or whatever, I want to go back and see what bed he came out of. I want to see, you know, right where he went through and stuff, and go walk his path and try to figure out why he did what he did.
Right.
Because contrary to popular belief, I don't think bucks do much of anything random.
Right.
So, and you've seen that. I mean, we go back to an area,
Yeah,
we walk
we've
through
done
there.
it.
I always go out of my way to go see, well, why did that deer do what it did? Let's go find out, you know.
And I think that's a change. It's a really good change in mindset. When you guys observe something, go back in there and then think about in spring scouting. Think about why that buck was doing what you saw him doing during the season.
Yeah, no, let's just go a little contrary on that, just to mix it up a little. Right?
Sure.
With that said, most of the time I'm not going back and looking at these bedding areas. The majority of the time. I'm going back if I have a question. I do not want to get my scent in, or even in spring, if I don't have to. The more times you enter those buck bedding areas, the less likely a big buck is going to feel comfortable bedding there. The ones I like the most are the ones where the buck doesn't bed there at that time of the year.
Right.
If they're not there, then I feel like I have a free reign of the place.
Right.
But if it's a primary bedding area that bucks bed all year, I do not want to go in there at any time of the year and chase those bucks out of there if I don't have to.
We've seen that with some of the marsh and swamp spots, because during the heavy winter, when you get a lot of snowfall, it knocks down all that heavy cattail and effectively takes care of all the cover around those tree pods, and it's like you can see across the whole thing, and they vacate it.
Right.
Right.
And then we have a free-for-all. We can go in there and do whatever we want.
Right.
That's not always the case. If you do have a spot that's being bedded all the time, you really don't want to go in there once you know the system. If you know how deer use it, it's a repetitive thing. They do the same thing year after year.
Yeah.
Going in there is killing it. It's like doing a deer drive on your farm.
Yeah.
You think you can get away with doing a drive one day out of the year, and it really ain't going to affect those deer. Bull crap. There's a huge difference between a farmer that does that one day a year drive and the one that don't. You know, we've talked about this before. You see this farm where an anti-hunter owns it, and nobody is allowed to hunt there. There's no difference between that farm and the farms next to it. But that farm, opening day of gun season, there's 10-pointers out eating in the clover. Why? It's pressure.
Yeah.
It's simply because they don't allow anybody to go in there. We got one over by Dave's farm where they don't allow anybody on their property. Never have, never will. If you shoot a deer and it runs in there, they will not let you get it. It will rot. They are anti-hunters completely, totally against hunting. They think it's cruel and mean, and they don't let anybody in there. You can go past here in the middle of the day, there'd be big 10-pointers around, hanging out in those fields. There's not anymore. You know why? Farm got sold. Now it gets hunted. All of a sudden, it's like every other farm there.
Yeah.
Now that guy could still have that farm with those killer bucks. He bought it probably because of those bucks, because the guy's a hunter. But all of a sudden now, it's just no bucks there. And that guy's probably sitting there scratching his head, what happened? You know, there's nobody hunting this. You are.
Yeah.
You know, that's where a guy buys a property and he thinks, well, now I got this property. There's no hunting pressure. It's just me. There's nobody on that property. There's you.
Yeah.
And if you hunt that every day and you don't go mix it up with some public and you don't go someplace else, you've got more pressure on that little 40 you saved your whole life to hunt than what's on the public. You just ruined that property because there's more pressure there than on the public. But they can't get that. Their pressure too.
Right. No, that's a good point. All right, next one. Scouting with stand on back. What are you looking for based on terrain and time of year? What is your approach to avoid being seen, heard, winded, getting close? If you bump satellite deer near where do you decide to set up? Do you stay or move?
Okay, let's break it down one question at a time. What was the first one?
What are you looking for based on terrain and time of year with a stand on your back going in?
Transition and thick. You know, it's got to be thick. It can't be open. And I'm looking for that I can go in there without getting winded. So, draw a little swamp here, okay? And the outside of that is woods, right? And I think that the buck is along this transition somewhere here, right? Wind's blowing this way today, so I'm scouting this edge, standing in the back. Okay, and if I'm scouting that transition, there's a distance I stay away from that transition. It would be real easy to walk right on the edge of it, because where it comes out of that swamp, you're going to see the sign real well. You're going to see the tracks real well and stuff.
Right.
But if you're walking there and you find that sign, this is usually too thick to shoot into. So you got to get the deer to walk out. Now you got your scent on the edge. So I'm walking about 10 yards from that edge trying to peek in. Setting up. The trouble with that is if they're bedding right on the edge, you spook them.
Yeah.
If they're bedding in a transition in or further back, well, then you can get them, but you just have to be quiet, move slow.
Yeah, and what I've noticed doing this is that during the early season, when it might be you got more water and more wet out here, there is deer that'll come up and bed on this edge
Yep.
more because the cover is thicker.
Mm-hmm.
And then as that cover falls off and it gets later in the season, they start moving to those beds that are more out here. So, that distance from that transition.
A lot of times
Really depends
too,
on the
it ain't
site.
really a straight edge like that neither. You got little points that come in
Yeah.
like this and stuff too, and then I'll loop along the edges of these points and look for rub lines coming out, sign coming out, and then I'll decide how far close I want to creep. And that's a lot of times on these points where you get them right on the point, looking up the point.
Yeah, and if you're in hill country or in farm country, we kind of touched on this. Dan touched on it in talking about those hill and farm country
Mhm.
questions. He talked about using a fence line or a fence row to protect your
Mhm.
site in. Obviously, looking at wind as well. But
Hill country might be a little different, as in I might go straight to certain points as I'm scouting and look at rub lines or something. And even in swamp, I might have areas in mind where I know that there's occasional movement through them, or it's a piece of terrain that on a map looks good. I want to see what's going on there, and I'll go there and figure out on that map where can I look at that point without busting the tip or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
And nowadays, guys got that right on their phone. They can be walking up on something, and go, oh, there's a point coming up. Here's how I got to look at that, you know.
right. So, and that kind of leads to the next one. How do you avoid being seen, heard, winded, and getting close?
Well, I'm being quiet, keeping the wind in my face. I'm scouting a certain way with a certain wind,
Right.
and waiting for a different wind before I scout that other side. Seeing, I'm using terrain, I'm going slow. If it's a spot where you're prone to getting seen, you could go on a windy or rainy day when things are moving around and they can't see you.
Right.
Rain will cover your sound from walking because the leaves will be wet.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm just going slow. The thing is too, you read between the lines. Don't be afraid of spooking a few deer. Crap
Right,
happens.
This next question is: if you bump a satellite deer near where you decide you should set up, do you stay or move on?
And there you go. He's paranoid of bumping deer, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Most people are,
Yeah.
and I don't think it's a bad thing. I can tell you on many occasions I've bumped deer and still killed deer. Think about that swamp time that we went out and we bumped those deer like 3 times going in.
Right.
I set up and ended up. I
Two
think
of the bucks.
I think I ended up shooting one of them. The
Right.
ones we bumped.
Yeah.
Because they went into an area and I thought, well, they're probably bedding in here. And I set up, and when they got up to leave, I even called them back.
Right.
But I've kicked deer through bedding areas and right through the area where I'm planning on the buck coming out of. And you're like, you set up and you watch a buck get up right there and come in. How many times you walking through there and you look down, you see a buck bedded, and they just let you walk past. If you stop and look at them, they jump out. But how many times do they just sit there?
Right.
They're just deer. They're not the brightest animals in the world. If a deer runs past them and there's a half an hour left of hunting, he's probably not going to get up and just walk free for all right up to you in the direction that deer came from. He might not. But I think your odds go way up if it's earlier in the day. If you go out there to hunt and there's 3 hours before those deer get up and a deer runs past him, he's going to freak out for a minute, hunker down, watch, listen. It's probably a good time for you to be quiet.
Yeah.
Not give up your cards and go, look at the deer running off or something to your buddy. It's probably a good time to be quiet, stop moving, just sit back for a little bit. Relate it to yourself. You're in a tree stand. You're looking at a bedding area. You hear a branch break, the unmistakable sound of a deer coming. You hear it. You heard a sloshing step.
Right.
What do? You concentrate on it. You look at it. You're waiting. You're getting your bow ready. You're anticipating, right? How about after a half an hour? Nothing else has happened. I don't know about you, but I can't even remember it then.
Yeah.
Because that deer is it was coming. You're believing it, right? After half an hour, you got yourself convinced maybe it was a squirrel, maybe it was a bird, maybe you're hearing things. I don't know. Maybe it was a deer. Maybe you've forgotten about it completely. A deer's the same way. I mean, you give them enough time, And that deer running past is just totally forgotten about. He gets up, walks past you like nothing. And I've had it happen more than once, where I've killed a deer after I've spooked a deer right through his bedding area.
Yeah.
Don't let that ruin your hunt. Don't get it in your head. Just let it go. Obviously, you don't want to do it, but if it happens, it happens. And there's some areas I can't hunt unless I spook deer through the bedding area. And am I just going to give that deer a free ride? No free rides from this guy. I'm going in there and I'm hunting them. And if I chase deer through there, I'm making sure I'm early enough that hopefully he forgets about what happened.
Right. Yeah, and this goes into your plan for how you stage hunt close to that bed. And if you bump deer, I know Dan's had stories of bumping deer and saying, you know what, I'm going to set up on this bed anyways. He set up on the bed and the buck came back. And I had that scenario last year where I bumped that buck, well, that deer off that bed, and I walked past it and hunted the tip. And that deer backdoored me. I couldn't see him, but I heard him like an hour later walk back to his bed.
Yep.
So then it begs the question, like if I would have set up for that other bed and not walked to the tip, would I have got a chance at that deer coming back to his bed? Because he didn't see, he didn't see me, he didn't smell me, he heard me, and he didn't like what he heard. So yeah, that's interesting. All right, we only got a few more questions.
That was Ghost Hunter.
Yeah.
He wants us to use Mega Man.
Nice.
You got Starbucks today.
Deer exit routes. How do you determine where they are? How to use them to your advantage? Also, how to determine if a bed is being used, even if it isn't much sign there. So we touched on deer exit routes before, but you probably got some other comments on it.
No, I pretty much touched on that before. I think you got to look close.
Yeah.
You just got to do the work. I mean, it has nothing to do with wind. It has nothing to do with anything but where food is, where the does are, and a lot of times you're not going to know that. A lot of times it's guessing, because sometimes they're traveling further than you think.
Yeah,
it's just a matter of work.
And review real simple what we said, what Dan had said before is that, you've got your bed. Typical patterns, the heavier trails coming out of that are the exits because he's just hitting it and going.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, you got food, you got doe, and you've got the unknown. So, all these are potential hunting sets. And with all these scenarios, it's the sight, the sound, scent, and think about how he's leaving that
Right.
spot and why.
What was the second half of this?
Yeah, he's wondering if this bed has next to no sign around it.
Well, if it's a well-used...
How do you know it's being used?
Number one, I think there's a big misleading concept of this whole tactic that single beds are what I'm setting up on, and generally it's not.
It's clusters of
It's clusters of bedding. And
yeah.
single beds, it's really hard to find a good one. That's not to say it doesn't happen. I killed my biggest buck out of a bed that's a single bed. So it does happen, but it's more rare. Generally, bedding areas where you're killing big bucks are primary bedding areas that have, and if they're not primary, they're at least primary for a portion of the year. There's this
Right.
time frame when they're being used heavy. And there's going to probably be anywhere from 3 or 4 beds to 50, in a bedding area that's the size of an acre. And that's what I'm looking for. So that's what I'm getting at with that whole, is the bed well used, not well used, or something.
Yes.
I worry about his reference to the bed.
You know what? And that's fair that he makes that reference, because a lot of people on the site, and I'm guilty of this too, when you talk about a
Mhm.
bed that you've hunted, you typically talk of it in terms of
Yep.
the bed. But
And I do it too.
Right. But even most of the areas we're talking about are like Dan said, they're a cluster of those beds or a cluster of bedding areas.
And that's what you should really be looking for.
Yeah.
Because we do find single beds in like ideal spots that get used quite a bit. And they're worth hunting.
Right.
But it's not the typical scenario. The typical scenario, a spot worth hunting has a lot of beds. But if you have a single bed that is well used, has a lot of sign in it, and you want to give that a shot, number one, it's usually only used on a certain wind, if it's one bed, unless it's really in thick cover. And number two, it's usually used for a certain time frame. Because when you get to those clusters of beds, you know why there's a cluster? It's because they're shifting around based on the wind and based on the time frame of the year. So you're looking for a lot of beds if you're looking for something that's used a lot.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you brought that up. If you've got one in an overlooked spot, or you got that one beat down bed, wind, time frame of the year, food, that buck, that might be the best spot in that area where the predominant wind, the wind that's most likely always happens, and that's the best spot in that area, so that buck is always using it, and maybe it's in proximity to food, or maybe it's in proximity to doe bedding, so it's used a lot even though it's a single bed, because these factors are so common, like they're repeatable, the food and the
I think about that big non-typical I shot, the one I crawled up on and shot.
right.
That was a single bed. But when was he there? Only on a west wind.
Yeah.
He was always there on a west wind, but well, not always. But the majority of time he would bed in that spot when there was a west wind, and he was there quite often.
Yeah.
But a west wind. Why? Because he didn't have a bed there for an east or south, or because they got to have all their bases covered.
Right.
A big buck will not bed someplace unless he knows what's going behind them, knows what's going on in front of him, knows what's going on off to the sides.
Yeah, so some of those spots based on wind might provide very limited options for the buck to bed. So that's why that single bed is there. It's kind of what you're saying, right?
Right. I mean, if it's got real heavy wear, it's got everything it needs, and you think it's being used quite a bit, yeah, hunt it. But try this scenario for yourself, and throw a stand at it early season, throw a stand at a rut, throw a stand at a late season, and see what happens. And if you don't get a shot at them in those 3 time frames, at least be keen enough to observe if the sign has changed in regards to rubs and how well the trails is being used and stuff since you were there the time before, so that you get a time frame of when that buck is using that bed.
Yeah, we kind of got off the question a little, but because he, if there isn't much sign on that bed to know whether or not it's being used, and it's like, well...
I find hundreds of beds like that a year, and I don't even go back.
Yeah.
And that's really the sad truth. I think it's hard for somebody to swallow who's just getting into this, and they found 7 beds, and they're trying to do a season of bed hunting. I don't go back and hunt the majority of beds I find.
Yeah.
Because the majority of them are small deer, or random. You think about it like this: when we talk about bedding, and we talk about how they bet on points, they bet on fingers, they bet on these hard transitions and stuff, right?
Yeah.
And you go out into these areas and you start finding beds all over the place. You start finding them everywhere. And the truth of the matter is the mature bucks got their bases covered. They got the best spots, the kind of spots we talk about, and they got them locked in. And there's lots of deer out there. The rest of the deer got a bed somewhere, and they're filling in the voids. And a lot of guys are finding the void beds, the beds that really don't matter to me or you.
Right.
And they're wanting to set up and hunt on those. And I think they got to keep looking, keep diving in. And I don't want to say that, though, because this guy might be onto a bed where that big buck is bedding occasionally. And you might be right, and I might be wrong. But the only way to really find that out isn't for me to tell you. Is to go out there and throw a stand at it and find out.
Right.
You will find beds that occasionally get used that do have giant bucks bedding there on a regular basis. I think of Dave's. Davis doesn't have that real heavy pressure, but that one slope, those big bucks always come off of if they're bedding there, right?
Yeah.
Go in there and find a bed. It's hard to see. It doesn't look well used. There isn't rubs around it. But when we get a big buck there out of that bedding area, that's where he comes from. So that's just something you have to learn through time, trial and error. And that's not something I can help you with.
Yeah. Yeah, we touched on this one somewhat before, but it's timing of when to hunt pressured beds.
We did touch on that earlier. That's like the one where I hunt it 2 weeks after pheasant opens.
Right.
The good thing about pressured beds is they better be decent all year. They just get really good after the pressure.
Yeah. Next one. What do you do differently when hunting at farm, which is on top and these woods are below, versus when the ag is below with normal hill country? So
There ain't much of a difference. I'm hunting both. When the deer might be going down low even though there's ag on top. It all depends on what they're doing. If they're looking for does, if they're looking for oaks, if they're acorns or what. But if what his question is, if you drop the egg part out of it and say when deer are rising versus when they're dropping.
yeah, so that here versus bed here. Yep, you hit it right on the head. So they're dropping versus rising.
No, that is not what he's saying at all.
That's not what he's saying?
No.
Okay.
He's saying the deer are bedding. Erase that.
Why is
That's not what he's saying at all. He's saying, here's a point, right? Wind's blowing like this. Deer's bedding here, okay? What are we doing different if the food source where he's traveling to is there versus here?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying.
No, you're putting the deer bedded down here.
Well, in essence, he is.
No, he's not.
Okay, well,
Deer's bedding in the same spot. Where's he traveling to?
right. I just drew two different diagrams. Here's the food plot. Here it is down here.
Okay, well the deer's in the same spot.
Yes.
All right.
That's fine.
So what I'm doing different is just how I set up. And I mean, it's really what we talk about all the time. I mean, he's here, and if he's going uphill, I'm setting up on a just off wind because he's bedding here on one of these winds. If he's dropping down, I'm getting below the thermal rise.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we did talk about that earlier. If the hill slopes down to this point here, it's the last transition line. I'm getting beyond that, so my scent ain't flowing up there with the thermals. It's the same thing as anything else. I'm looking where he's bedding, and I'm looking how far can he see, smell, and hear. Doesn't matter if he's dropping, rising, whatever. It's just that when he's dropping, I have to take thermals in effect. When he's rising, I have to take the natural wind that's blowing at him in effect. So if it's blowing like this, I'm going to have to be over here. I can't be over here. Or I'm going to have to get up above. I'm going to have to get to the point where that wind ain't hitting him. Plain and simple. I mean, I've had him come up like this, and I get on this side and have that wind just off. But
I would think it probably is a lot more challenging to try to hunt them from above, right?
no, I think it's easier. The challenge is below because you have to get so far back.
So you just want I see, because above you're going to get an off wind.
Right.
So you're going to get that off spot.
Yeah, it seems easier above.
Okay.
But below, the whole problem is that thermal deal. And a lot of times below, the one thing I do like about below is all else fails, and you can get on that slope, you can just sit back until that wind changes, the thermal change.
So in the morning, if you're hunting, in the morning on this slope, sun's beating down along here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is going to heat up,
Yep.
which is going to cause a rise,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's going to pull the thermals up, right?
Yep.
Okay. Now,
It's a vacuum effect because thermals rise straight up, but when wind whips over, it crosses a void and starts sucking it. And it's going to suck that thermal on his hill. And you'll actually, if you're standing on this hill, if it's a steep hill, you'll feel the wind blowing right up the hill.
right. So a morning hunt from down below, you've got that huge challenge.
Well, you say morning, but that kind of throws me off a little bit because
Well,
early
that's what
morning.
I'm asking.
Early morning's a little different.
Okay.
you kind of get that drop for a while, or right around dawn,
Right.
and then there's a switching point when the sun starts heating up that hill.
So you will get the drop effect, but then
Right, there's gonna be a switching point.
as the heat starts hitting the side of this hill, you're going to get that switch.
Right.
Okay. And then, so in the evening, I know you've talked about this before, but what's that pooling effect? So if this is a field, and this is a kind of where it starts, that lowest point of entering the field, and it draws down this hill where he's bedding. So how are those thermals?
Okay.
Are they dropping then?
I don't know about dropping down to where he beds. That would be a really hard deer to kill if that was the effect. But
Right.
It could happen.
Right.
I could see that being the case. But when you got a low point on a field, a field's like this, deer want to come into this spot in the field because all the way around, thermal drop will go to that point. Because it's like pouring water on the hill. And that's the problem with hunting below them, is when you pour water on that hill, it's going to run down to you.
Right.
I take that back. That's why you want to set up down there after the thermal switch,
Right.
because of that. But during when the thermals are rising, when the sun's shining on there, you got to get below where they're rising from.
Right.
You got to get beyond where it's pulling up the hill, and that's not an easy task to get close enough and still be down below.
Right, and I'm understanding that right because this portion is then cooling.
Yeah, it's when the shadow goes over the field.
Right, the shadow's going to go over it. This is cooling, and then those thermals are going to pull down in,
Right.
and that's it's weird.
That's the hard part about hill country, is you got two winds you got to work with, and both of those winds change. The thermals change based on sunlight, whether the sun is down or the sun is up, and there's a changing point right at the twilights when we hunt, when it switches,
Right.
and you got to deal with the regular natural wind.
Right, so if he's coming up above, you got to have that off spot for both your wind and your thermals. Let's say in
I
the
love on a
evening.
point on the sides, because your thermal is going to drop in the evening, and you can get on the downwind side of the wind, right? You can-
Right. Yep.
You always got to take thermals into consideration in hill country. Always. Wind is something that's unpredictable. Thermals, they will do what they're supposed to do. It's like clockwork. You could set your watch to it.
So on the low side, if you're hunting, like he's saying, that food source on the low side, the biggest thing here, if you're doing
Is getting in there,
In the evening hunt.
getting in there before that thermal change, and having your thermals rise into them. Because that thermal ain't going to change until the sun ain't shining down there no more. When there's a shadow cast across this field is when that thermal's going to start to switch. And not until then. Because this ground is going to be warmer than the air. And it's going to cause that air rise, which is going to cause, with that wind, that suction. So you can either get in here after the sun drops,
right.
which gives you a half an hour to hunt, and you got to do it quick, or you get far enough back that you're not in that affected area.
Right, where your thermals aren't shooting up there, and so you're not affected. But then it's going to take him longer to get to you,
Right.
potentially. Yeah.
Or you can stage hunt. You sit back here, and then when the time is right, run up to here. A lot of times, though, at this point, can be seen from the bed, in a lot of cases. So a lot of cases, you got to be back here anyways. What's nice is a lot of them are sloped hills, and you can get on the edge of this hill, but then you might get thermal drop again, affecting you, The hunting below them is a lot harder than hunting above them. You get a lot of stuff that comes into effect.
Nice. That was a good question. Minus my picture, I guess. No.
Yeah.
All right. What do you do differently when hunting? Oh yeah, we did this one. Okay, that was the one we just did. Yeah. How do bucks move differently? That's kind of a general question. Oh, this was tethered on to these last two, so yeah, I think we covered this. How do bucks move differently, and how does scent and airflow move differently? All right, so this is the last question we have on the list. So tips for hunting out of state is the first one.
Have a dependable car,
Dependable car.
dependable truck.
Okay.
Yeah. Hunting out of state. I
I mean, doesn't this really kind of speak to hunting out of your comfort zone?
Right,
Hunting out of your
exactly.
area,
That's what I was thinking too.
out of
Is
familiar
you know, it doesn't have to be out of state. Just travel into a different area and hunting. And I guess basically, when I'm going to a new area, I'm studying maps.
Yeah.
Gonna have some dedicated time for scouting. I would like to get there and scout prior to hunting. A lot of guys will not put that into the equation, and they pay for it.
Yeah.
If you have the time, if you can make the time, get up there and scout first before you ever step foot on the property. Go there first for a scouting trip.
Yeah.
If you can't, do it all with maps, but dedicate some time during the day for scouting. Most of the guys do these trips during the rut, and a lot of guys make the mistake of picking rut funnel spots on a map and planning on sitting there all day, every day.
Yeah.
Don't do that. Have some scouting time. Even if you have some good spots you pick out, it does not hurt you to look around. A lot of times you stumble into that awesome spot that'll be your kill spot from then on. That you have to get out of that comfort zone of these are my spots. Always be thinking about moving. Always be looking for better and more.
Probably another one on here is don't assume, but know the local law. Make sure you know all the regulations to wherever you're traveling.
Yeah.
Typically within state, there isn't too much variance, but if you're going out,
Yeah, you start traveling to other states, you really run into some weird stuff if you don't know somebody from around those areas. And I can remember the first time I hunted in southwestern Iowa. I mean, it was strange. There's different laws. I mean, if your buck runs onto somebody's property, you don't have to ask permission to go get it. And I shot a buck, and it jumps in this deep, raging river, goes across, runs up the ridge on the other side, and dies in this guy's pasture. And I had asked this guy at this house for permission to hunt the day before, and he came out screaming at me that how dare I ask to kill their deer, and that they love these animals and stuff. I mean, they were chasing me down the driveway practically. Don't ever come near my property. We're going to be watching for you. And now it dies on their property.
yeah,
And I had to go over and get it, and I'm like, okay, I have a law that protects me. I can go over and just get this deer. So I flew out there, went in that pasture, picked up that deer, threw it in my truck, and flew back to the edge of that pasture, and I can look, and there's this truck flying down that driveway. And there's only one way out. It's a dead end. I got to go past their driveway. So I come up there, and he blocks the road, and this two giant guys get out, and they're racing to the truck, and I don't want to get punched through the window, so I jump out of the truck. And the guy gets up to me, and he goes, "What the hell are you doing on my property?" And I says, "Hey, I shot a deer, it ran on your property, I just went to fetch it. I was hunting on the other side of the river." And he looks in the back of the truck, he goes, "Why'd you say something?" He gets in his truck and drives away, and it's like, so different from Wisconsin.
yeah,
Yeah, not that answers his question, but it is different going to different places, and you got to learn things, and you got to,
yeah.
Anything else on that?
I don't really have anything. I mean, some of the other guys on the site that do a lot of this stuff out of state.
It seems like a strange question to me because every year I hunt new places. They're not necessarily out of state, but I go to new areas. I get out of my comfort zone a lot, and it just seems like that's just the way I hunt. So it's hard to answer the question because it's really the same stuff we're doing any place else. And when I hunted Iowa, that was that southwestern Iowa. Make this clear, that was a 10.5-hour ride from my house. You know what I did when I went down there hunting? That summer, I drove down there for 4 days and scouted.
Yeah.
That put me in good hunting. That 4 days, you're going to take a 10-day vacation to go hunting. I would rather take a 6-day vacation to go hunting and have 4 days of scouting freehand.
Right.
Where I can walk through all those bedding areas, walk through all that stuff, learn all that stuff, and never touch foot on that ground. And some guys are like, "No, I only got a week to hunt. I only got 7 days. I can't give any of that up. That's what I have for vacation." Take 2 of those days and go scout.
Right.
Trust me, your hunt will be way, way, way better.
All right, the next one. This is another one. I'd like to hear your beliefs on what's legal versus what's ethical.
I think anything that's legal is pretty much ethical. It's up to you. Ethics and morals are within the holder. They're within the person. It's up to you to decide what you think. I mean, you take a look at like Pope and Young Club. Everybody looks at it as like it's a record-keeping organization. It's not. It's a private club. So even though you shoot something legal, they don't have to put it in the record books, and they don't.
Right.
They won't put it in there if you shoot it with a lit knock. They won't put it in there if you shoot it with a certain bow. It doesn't matter if it's legal. That's their ethics. That's their morals. That's their beliefs. My belief is that if you shoot that animal, you kill that animal within the limits of the law, and you believe what you're doing is good and ethical, it's good and ethical. If you can't sleep at night, then it's not.
Right.
You know, you have to worry about you and not about other people. And I can't tell you what's morally or ethically sound for you or your family or your way of thinking. That's up to you to decide. Morals and ethics are in here. They're per person, and I don't know what more to say about that than you'd have arguments about that all day long on a forum.
Right.
Some guys think that rifle hunting is cheating. Some guys think that bow hunting with a compound is cheating. And the guy who uses the recurve thinks he's better than me. Not necessarily. I'm not picking on anybody.
Right.
But it's up to you. I mean, you use a crossbow, I use a compound. I could care less what you use. I worry about me. And that's not to say that the crossbow is worse than what I'm doing or better than what I'm doing. I wouldn't care if you're hunting with a rifle. I don't care what you do. Do you care what I do?
No.
Because I care about me. You see, many people get worked up about what other people do. I don't even care if the guy that lives next door to me is a poacher. That's his problem. I'm not a game warden. What do I care? If you care too much about that, you're too competitive about hunting. You're too worried about what the next guy is doing. There is always going to be cheaters. There's always going to be people who are fake. There's always going to be that. There's no way you can clean up hunting to the point where you take all that out of there. And because of that, if you're comparing what you do as an ethical, moral person to what everybody around you does, you're going to have a hard life. You have to worry about you and your goals. That goes right into the whole point of, because I was so obsessed with hunting when I was younger that my wife had to sit home alone and had to have all of our money put into hunting and not into where we lived or what we drove or how, or into a vacation or to have a normal life with my kids and spend Halloweens with them because I was a bad father. That somebody who's a good father who doesn't kill as many bucks isn't as good a hunter.
Yeah.
It goes into the same thing. Moral and ethics are here. They're ever changing. And it's up to you as an individual to decide how you feel about that stuff and be yourself. Just do yourself a favor and don't worry about what other people are doing. Don't worry about their morals, their ethics. Worry about number one. Worry that you're teaching your kids what you believe is sound and that you can sleep at night feeling that what you do, you believe in, and don't care what your friends think, don't care what other people think. Just worry about number one.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to define those questions for yourself because with any of these pursuits, there's the letter of the law, but you can't live yourself by the letter of the law and rules. You can do a pretty easy gut check on moral and ethics and know whether or not what you're thinking about or what you're considering to do, whether it's shooting after that first light or whatever, different scenarios where you want to push the boundaries. I mean, is it really worth it?
You got to look at who you're hunting with because I'm wondering why this guy asked this question this way.
Well,
if you're hunting with somebody and you're doing a question check on his morals or beliefs, or if they clash with yours,
then just find someone else.
Yeah, maybe it's a good guy to golf with.
Yeah,
probably not a good guy to hunt with.
Surround yourself with the type of hunters and the people that you would be around with normally, because they're just good people in general, and that's a common advice for anything actually.
Right.
All right. Well, I know this got us through the the remaining 22 questions that were on the board. So I know there were a few more questions posted up there, which we can circle back on at a later time. But
Yeah, when we get enough to do it again.
yeah, so
This is fun, and I think that ongoing, this is a good way to do some of these podcasts.
yeah,
I like the questions and answers. I mean, it brings out the greatness of what we do, and I think sometimes it retouches on subjects and pulls out stuff that we never got out before.
yeah. So good. Thanks again for these questions, and we'll keep doing this. So talk to you later. That concludes today's podcast episode. Please go to thehuntingbeast.com to post any discussions, questions, or comments regarding today's podcast episode.